Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most fascinating, complex, and really decades-long debates playing out on the world stage right now, and that is European migration and identity. For decades, Europe was seen as the absolute ultimate success story. We're talking about a continent that rose from the sheer devastation of war to become one of the most peaceful, wealthy, and tolerant societies on the planet. But recently, that image has been fracturing a bit. So today, we're going to look closely at exactly why that's happening. Okay, let's dive right into this. Because when we see news out of Europe today, the focus is almost always on borders, right? It's inflatable boats, it's physical barriers, but what if that is entirely missing the point? The core argument we're exploring today is that what Europe is experiencing isn't just a simple immigration crisis. It's actually a much deeper crisis of belonging. The true problem isn't merely about how many people arrived, but rather that Europe opened its borders much faster than it managed to build a common identity capable of really integrating those newcomers. To understand exactly how this happened, we're going to follow a clear, chronological roadmap. We'll start with the post-World War II moral shift, move into the economic miracle, trace the rise of parallel societies, examine the breaking point of the 2015 migration crisis, contrast Europe's approach with the United States, and finally, look at this modern crisis of belonging. Section 1. The post-World War II moral shift, reinventing Europe. Picture this. Starting in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, Europe was just in ruins. Over 50 million people were dead. The continent had to face a truly horrifying reality. The civilization that considered itself the most advanced in the world had produced the absolute horrors of the Holocaust and extreme political fanaticism. This intense trauma triggered an urgent need for a massive moral transformation. To understand the Europe of today, we absolutely have to go back to the specific moment when Europe decided to morally reinvent itself. Because of that trauma, the new Europe actively and deliberately rejected its past. Ideas of extreme nationalism, dominant cultural identities, aggressive pride, all of that was viewed with intense distrust. Instead, modern Europe built its new soul entirely around a different set of cooperative values. We're talking human rights, international cooperation, equality, minority protections, and profound tolerance. The whole goal was to build a society that would literally never destroy itself again. Which brings us to Section 2. The economic miracle, rapid industrial growth. So while Europe was morally rebuilding, it was also experiencing unprecedented physical rebuilding. Countries like West Germany and France entered a period of rapid, astonishing industrial growth. Factories were churning out machinery, steel, and cars at record speeds. But there was a massive logistical problem. Millions of working-age men had died during the war. The economies were booming way faster than the local populations could actually sustain. The simple fact was, Europe literally needed more workers. And this is where a temporary fix quickly became a permanent reality. To fill the labor shortage, European governments brought in workers from places like Turkey, Morocco, and India. Now, the original plan was super simple. Step 1, sign temporary work contracts. These young men would arrive, earn money, help rebuild, and go home, right? Well, Step 2 happened instead. Many stayed and brought their wives and children over. And by Step 3, they were establishing permanent communities, small businesses, and local associations. It was a completely organic progression, but it meant that a temporary economic strategy had morphed into a permanent demographic transformation. Section 3, Rise of Parallel Societies. The integration question. Once it became completely obvious that these diverse communities were staying permanently, Europe faced a question it really wasn't prepared to answer. Because Europe had learned to reject the idea of cultural imposition after the war, they didn't force integration. They just assumed democratic institutions and tolerance would naturally create coexistence. But instead, communities developed a social life increasingly separate from the rest of the host nation. And it didn't happen out of malice, it happened for practical reasons. If you arrived in a new country, you naturally moved to the neighborhood where people spoke your language, where you could find familiar food, and where you could rely on family networks. Over decades, this created entire urban enclaves functioning almost completely independently from the broader society. Now, this created a really unique and often very difficult micro-narrative, particularly for the youth. The second generation, the kids born to these immigrants, often found themselves feeling trapped between two entirely different worlds. During the day, they attended secular European schools that championed individualism, equality, and personal autonomy. But then they'd go home to traditional households with strict parental authority and completely different expectations regarding religion, relationships, and daily life. They didn't feel fully connected to their parents' country of origin, but they also didn't feel fully accepted by the European society surrounding them. All right, Section 4, the 2015 migration crisis, a breaking point. For a long time, Europe managed these underlying societal tensions because, well, the economy was growing. But then, in 2015 alone, driven by conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Germany received over 1 million asylum seekers. Let that number sink in for a second. Over a million. Sweden took in record numbers per capita. The visual images of collapsed borders, improvised camps, and totally overwhelmed government systems sent absolute shockwaves across the continent. And this brilliantly illustrates the tipping point. The sheer suddenness and size of this crisis made those simmering underlying doubts about integration impossible to ignore any longer. It led to institutional collapse, intense political polarization, the rapid rise of anti-immigration voting, and a deep distrust towards elites. The conversation violently shifted. Immigration was no longer just debated as an economic or humanitarian issue, it became an existential debate about cohesion. People began asking, hey, if we were already struggling to integrate communities that have been here for generations, how on earth are we going to absorb this massive new wave? Section 5, Europe versus the United States, two different models. Both Europe and the United States take in millions of diverse immigrants, but look at the difference in philosophy here. To truly understand why Europe struggles with this specific cultural paradox, it really helps to compare it to a completely different model of immigration. Europe, scarred by World War II, has a deep historical distrust of dominant cultural identities. They fear that asserting a strong national culture might lead back to the dark days of their past. The United States, on the other hand, operates on an explicit expectation of a shared national identity. Whether through the flag, the language, or civic education, there's an overarching narrative of becoming American. So, the crucial point is that the core contrast is not about the origin of the immigrants. The real difference is what society expects after those immigrants arrive. The U.S. model, for all its flaws and historic struggles with discrimination, still confidently demands a shared civic belonging. Europe, conversely, opened its societies but simultaneously lost confidence in the legitimacy of transmitting its own shared national identity. Which leads us to Section 6, a crisis of belonging. More than institutions. Post-war Europe successfully built some of the most amazing physical and economic systems in human history. Welfare systems successfully reduce poverty. Democratic institutions absolutely guarantee rights. The state builds incredible infrastructure, hospitals, schools, transit systems. But here is the catch. Institutions alone cannot create belonging. You can have citizenship, public education, and welfare, and still feel entirely disconnected from the place where you live. Belonging requires a shared idea of who we are and what values unite us. And that's something far less visible and much, much harder to manufacture. And that leaves us with this final, profound question to consider today. How can a society successfully integrate newcomers if it no longer knows its own identity? Europe spent decades trying so hard not to repeat the extreme mistakes of its past that it slowly lost clarity on what common identity it actually wanted to transmit to its future. It's a paradox of tolerance, and it is the exact tension driving headlines today. Think about that as you watch world events unfold. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time.